Uh, it's been a long time, but this is a very special occasion for all of us. The McDonogh Network takes us all the way back to the very beginning of our Black presence at Lafayette College. And I'm very proud to introduce Robert Young today, class of 2014, currently the Director of Intercultural Development at Lafayette College. As an assistant director, he's responsible for overseeing a lot of the cultural activities on campus, including issues of gender, sexuality, programming for international students. This is an office that provides key support. A lot of the mentoring and advising that used to be done by one or two of us is now institutionalized, and Rob fortunately have the resources and the staffing to do that. Diversity and inclusion is really a big part of what we've been working for, and the McDonogh Network is designed to provide that emotional, technical, academic support, communication, and a lot of other things that our students need. Rob majored in film studies, media, gender, and gender studies as well. Previously worked in the alumni office as the support for alums, and now has transitioned to the Office of Intercultural Affairs. And we are very proud to see him give this presentation about the history of the McDonogh brothers at Lafayette College. So welcome, and Rob Young, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Good afternoon, beautiful people. So glad to connect with you all this afternoon, and just wanted to give a round of applause to Rex, truly a living legend for your just years of service, truly, truly, truly being a trailblazer, not only for faculty, but for our alumni, for our students, because a lot of what we have today is because of the advocacy work that you did and continue to do. So we have to give roses when they're due. And so hats off to you. And just, again, thank you so much for being that living legend. I also want to give a thank you to the McDonogh Network and the co-chairs for inviting me to speak with you all today. Another thank you to Heather Reiner, who is the designer when I was thinking about the curation of what this exhibit would be inside of Party Hall. Also to Diane Shaw, who was the special collections and the college archivist at the time. John McKnight, who is the Dean of Intercultural Development at the time, and also Professor Wendy Wilson Fall, who is the current Department Head of Africana Studies, and is someone who continues to keep the work of not only the letters in the archive, but to keep this story alive in the coursework that she's done in the classroom, but also to the independent study and the academic rigor that continues to manifest itself from this collection. So again, wanting to give those shout outs to those individuals. While I also have this platform, I would be remiss if I also didn't acknowledge that just because it's February, we shouldn't use this time to acknowledge the existence of Black bodies and Black people. The work of the McDonogh brothers and their legacy should be shared and talked about 365 days of the year at Lafayette College. Don't need to wait till February to talk about their dopeness and how they went on and to change the world. So I just, while I got the platform, might as well go ahead and put that out there. So again, wanting to make this conversation engaging. I don't want to be the floating head and we're just talking and going through slides. Definitely wanting to make sure that there's an opportunity for a Q&A. But in the photo behind me is a statue that exists on the, from looking on the west side of Skillman, is Transcendence. And it was a sculpture that was given to the college by Mel Edwards in 2009. And it's the Transcendence, let's go this way, here we go. It's the Transcendence sculpture. And it's a book, it's chains and they're unbroken. And it's because of, again, the work of David McDonogh. And how, again, despite all odds, how he overcome and again, changed the footprint for so many folks that came after him. So we'll go ahead and dive into this story. All right. Okay, so in this first slide, again, how I kind of got connected with this work was that I, was an intern with Diane Shaw in the Special Collections Office. And so my job was just to take the collection and digitize it. And so just going through these files, I found myself just reading and reading and reading and started to really create this visual image of what this story looks like. And so I was just at awe. And if I'm being honest, quite pissed off to actually hold the slave paperwork of David and Washington McDonogh. One, because I've never saw one before, but to know that the college actually owned and still has the paperwork of David and Washington McDonogh. And so again, you can see that it has their sex, they were male, age 25, and that they were Black, and their slave owner was John McDonogh. And so thinking about the story that I wanted to tell and how I wanted to curate this story, the story begins with this document. And so I wanted that to be at the forefront. I wanted that to be visible. And if folks were uncomfortable with it, then that was a good thing, because I know how that made me feel just holding it. But I wanted that to be visible and to really start that journey of what this means. And so we start now with John McDonogh, who was a very complicated individual, to say the least. And so John McDonogh was one of the largest slave holders in New Orleans at the time. And so he writes a letter, and that letter starts off with that I have slaves of great promise. And so he writes this letter to Walter Lowry, who at the time, Walter Lowry was the American Colonization Society liaison for the Presbyterian Church in Easton. And so he writes this letter to Walter Lowry telling him that I have these two slaves of great promise, and he quotes and says, my Black family, that I have this feeling about these boys, and that I feel like if you give them a chance at your institution, they can go off and make a great impact for their people. And we can send them back to Liberia and civilize the folks in Africa, and really not only embody the values that I've instilled in them, but also the values of God. And so how do we make this happen? How do we bring this full circle? Also with John McDonogh as well, at the time of his death, John McDonogh had the largest deed, the biggest will. And so his will went towards the New Orleans public school systems. And so at the time of his death, it was New Orleans schools numbers 0 through about 29. And so it was from elementary to high school. But one of the schools that remains is actually in Baltimore, and it's the McDonogh School for Boys. It's now co-ed, but that is actually where he's now buried, where he's on campus, and his bus is there. He's buried there. So he's at the McDonogh School in Baltimore. But again, we start this story with him saying that I have two slaves of great promise, but calls them his Black family. And so the master's plan. And so again, thinking about how do we just connect some of these dots, right? I'm going through these letters. I'm doing the investigative work of just trying to understand not only the complexity of John McDonogh, but also asking that question as why Lafayette, right? At the time, Lafayette was a manual labor college. So to go from New Orleans to Eastern Pennsylvania, where's the correlation? Where's the connection? So scratching my head and trying to understand what does that mean? And where does the American Colonization Society, what role does that play? So again, still a lot of questions, trying to connect those dots. But John McDonogh, again, in his writings to Walter Lowry, makes it very clear that no Black man will ever stand on the grounds of a white man and have the same rights. The two do not mix. It will never be equal. It will never be seen as the same, but keeps reiterating to these two individuals as my family, and that they have great promise. So walking contradiction, but what about these two are so special that you're willing to make that investment, to break the law, and to send them up the Mississippi to Eastern Pennsylvania, to Lafayette College? So seeing the letters and trying to, again, create this visual, the letters gave me this visual image, but also too, I saw the mannerisms and the demeanor of the two boys. And so it appeared, and again, looking at the letters, it was very much so two different mannerisms. David McDonogh was very much so this risk taker, challenged a lot of things, asked a lot of questions, where Washington was very much so like, if it's not broke, don't fix it. I won't rock the boat. Everything seems good, and I'll just follow status quo. And so David, in some of his writings, once he arrived to campus, you kind of saw that, but John called them a Madison and a Monroe, which I thought was quite interesting. And again, thinking about the context of American history at the time, I think that that is a very interesting comparison of a Madison and Monroe, because again, still very much so do not see Black people as equals at no point. And I'm referring to John McDonogh, but still, again, speaks very highly of these two. And again, to put in context, one of the largest slaveholders in the state of Louisiana and in New Orleans in particular. So still, again, asking these questions, what about these two are so special that you're having these correspondence with Walter Lowry, and again, telling him why these two are so special, and their intellectual curiosity and their mannerisms and their temperament, and how they not only challenge discourse, but how they kind of see the world and their ideology. So it's very fascinating when, again, thinking about that. And it's also fascinating that in the letters, John McDonogh says that David, and again, I'm sorry that you can't really see the text because I took from the panels that exist in Party Hall. But he says that for David is a boy that has bright parts. He's proud, he's brave, and is an inspiring disposition. And he says that Washington, not so bright, but creative, down to earth, super low key, right? So a Madison and Monroe. So again, thinking about who they are and what they bring to the table when thinking about what that transition will be for them once they come to campus. So now we're now thinking about College Hill in the context of where we are as a community and as a campus. And so for many folks, Lafayette College wasn't always on College Hill. Lafayette at one point was downtown Easton. For folks who may have been recently on campus or in Easton, Lafayette was where the McDonald's is in Easton. We didn't come up on College Hill until 1838. And so upon coming up on College Hill, there were very few campuses. And so one of the sketches that you can see at the bottom is the college edifice. And so that was the only in the main building on campus. And so that was the dormitory hall, that was the academic space, that was the first building for everything on campus, considering the fact that you had a campus community less than 20. So everybody lived in that building, being the president to everybody else. To also give context, when David and Washington McDonogh arrived to campus, they weren't allowed to live in the college edifice. So if the college edifice is where South College is today, they lived opposite ends of campus at the barns or the pastures where they kept the animals. So they weren't allowed to be in the little old building with everybody else. They were separated. And so again, thinking about that connection with Walter Lowry, still asking questions, still scratching my head as to what the relationship is and what's the connection. Walter Lowry, his affiliation was with the Presbyterian Church and with the American Colonization Society. So Walter Lowry again agreed that yes, you should bring these young men up to campus. I will then oversee them and will be their legal guardian while they're on campus. And so once Walter agreed that he'll be their legal guardian, the brothers then journey set from New Orleans up to the Mississippi to come to Lafayette College. I don't have letters, and we don't have letters to, again, articulate what that journey was like, how they got to College Hill, what was the means of transportation. The assumption is, again, by boat up the Mississippi. But again, we don't have letters to kind of talk about what that story and what that journey was like. But I can only imagine how grueling it must have been and how scary that must have been, knowing that, again, you're technically a runaway slave en routes and in hopes of what? What was that promise? What was that conversation? What was that expectation once you arrive to Eastern Pennsylvania, a foreign land, right? So again, thinking about that journey to Lafayette, to the north. And so again, I think, and the imagery that I have is that there was some type of expectation, there was some type of agreement. And again, I think that agreement was, and it's the last slide of that master plan, that you're gonna go get educated, and then we're sending you to Africa, and that you're gonna then be maybe again, a missionary for the church, or I don't know, someone who is again going to civilize the folks of Liberia. Again, we don't have those correspondents that speak directly to it, but there, again, there was some type of conversation, there was some type of plan as to your intentions behind you going there. This is one of, again, a very fascinating story that I just had to put into the exhibit. And so to give context as to who this woman is, she was called the mother of the Confederacy. And so she is the daughter of our first president, George Junkin. She is Margaret Junkin, who later became Margaret Jackson, who was the wife of Stonewall Jackson. And so if you've read any of her poetry, the language and the rhetoric around Black bodies and Black people is just downright disgusting, and doesn't speak at all highly of Black people. However, we do have 2 or 3 letters that she just raves about the McDonogh brothers. So again, still scratching our heads of this walking contradiction about who these young men were and how the most racist people just loved them, right? And so I just out of curiosity, I wonder. And so she speaks to them of, in one of the letters that she writes, and says, they speak multiple languages. They came to campus with a top hat, and were the only people on campus with silver pocket watches. And to give context, at the time, Lafayette did not have a campus clock or a tower. This is the introduction into Aaron Hoff. Aaron Hoff was one of the first Black students at Lafayette College, and his role was to blow the horn to let people know the transition of the day. So it was the end of class, it was the end of the day, it was the start of the day. And so Aaron Hoff's role was to let folks know what to do next. But again, she writes in a letter that these McDonogh brothers got some swag. And I don't know what it is about them, but I like it. And again, the only people on campus with a silver pocket watch. So it says that they come from a place of class and prestige. They were educated because they not only spoke multiple languages, but they could read and write. And so it was something about them that, again, the sister-in-law of Stonewall Jackson, the mother of the Confederacy, spoke so highly of David and Washington McDonogh. So again, it's just that walking contradiction of like, I wish we knew what they looked like, or, you know, I wish we had letters of their classmates of, you know, what did their classmates think of them? But for the letters that we have of Margaret Junkin, she speaks very highly of the McDonogh brothers. And so during this time period, from 1832 to 1846, there was also 10 other Black students who came to Lafayette, Black men that came to Lafayette during that time period. Not all of them graduated, but they, again, were enrolled into the college, and out of that 10, 4 of them went to Liberia and went on to Liberia. Again, their journeys and connections to Lafayette, still intrigued by, and I think, again, it's still an investigative story to better understand, to track, to understand. But again, just looking at the letters and trying to give context as to the time period, but also the institution, where were we at as a college that we were opening these doors to these individuals? But again, to not to get ahead of ourselves, but to fast forward now, who are they, why, and why we don't talk about them? So again, interesting. And so the split personality. So at this stage now, the story, David and Washington McDonogh have now been at Lafayette for now going on 5 years. They've taken enough classes. They did everything. They are, again, the Pepper Prize before the Pepper Prize. Everybody loves them. They are doing the thing, probably teaching some classes, probably tutoring folks, again, navigating the campus as if they own it. But now we have a rift. We now have a second president coming in, John Yeomans. And not that we have many letters from John Yeomans around the McDonogh brothers, but one of the letters that we have with John Yeomans, and I'm paraphrasing, is pretty much like, I don't know what to do with them, but they got to go. They've been here too long. I don't know what was agreed upon, but they got to go. They've been hanging around too long. They got to go. And so what's the game plan here? I need to have a conversation with Walter Lowry. So then Walter writes a letter to John McDonogh. What's our game plan? What would you like to do with the boys? And so John writes a letter to both David and Washington. It is now your time. This journey here at Lafayette College is over. It's time to head to Liberia to satisfy your mission or the plan that I have set forth for you. And so that was now where we had a split, not only with the brothers, not only with the institution, but also ideologies as to what this journey means for them. And so that's why I had this panel be split personalities, is because, again, not only did the institution now say, we've had enough of whatever this is, but again, I think that's where we start to see now the effects of that Madison and the Monroe, of the characteristics of the brothers. And so again, that reversing cell. So now we have taken you from a place to the reverse cell of sending you back to a place. And again, we don't have the letters. I don't know. I am making an assumption. But we're sending you to a place that's foreign and that you don't know, to fulfill whose destiny, to fulfill whose plan. But Washington agrees that that is where I need to be. That is where I need to go. And so that is what I have to do. And he writes to John McDonogh to say, I agree, absolutely. I'm ready to rock and roll. From the letters, David stops writing for a little bit. And David then proceeds to then when he writes that next letter to go, I don't know. Something just don't feel right. I'm not feeling fulfilled. George Junkin has left. I've outlasted him. This John Yeomans guy is talking about I gotta go, but I feel like I'm owed something because I'm still here, but it's, I can't put my finger on it, but I'm owed something and it doesn't feel right. And so again, David is still trying to navigate what just doesn't feel right. And so he writes a letter. And again, I'm paraphrasing, but in that letter, he goes, I have a passion for medicine. I love science. I'm really good at it. And I know it so well. I think I want to be a doctor. So he writes that letter to John McDonogh. John McDonogh goes, no, that wasn't the conversation. That wasn't the plan. You need to go to Africa. Go back to Africa. So then David writes the letter back. I don't know if that's going to work. I don't know if that's going to work. And I might need to find an avenue, or I need to find a mentor. I need to find somebody that's going to allow me to fulfill this plan, because I just know that that's where I need to be next. And so again, I think it's ironic. Before we had that motto as an institution of Kernan, David embodied that, right? So like, I think it's interesting when we think about the foundation of our institution, there was many people who were already doing that. So I wonder, did the institution finally catch up to what people were already doing? And then that's what we marketed, right? So again, scratching my head, and this is 20-year-old Rob, just looking at letters in the archive office, asking these questions, right? And so David writes back to say, again, like, I just know I have this interest. I know I have this passion, and I need to do it. I just need to do it. And so he finally takes a stance. And so in his stance, he writes a letter to say that there are no liberties that white guys at this school have that I shouldn't have. There's nobody on this campus that's smarter than me. There's nobody on this campus that is deserving of any liberties, of any resources and benefits if you don't work for them that I already haven't shown and displayed during my journey here. So this will be a letter to tell you that I am not going to Africa. This is a letter to tell you that I will become a doctor. And this is a letter to tell you that if you don't like it, I don't know what else to tell you. And this might be the last conversation we have. I will pause there to also say, again, I'm reading this letter to go, is he a slave? Because I think that's very fascinating that at any point, John McDonogh could make a phone call, write a letter to take you right back to New Orleans for being disobedient. Is that your dad? Is that what's the relationship here that you're so firm on taking this stance without repercussions? And again, that's what happens when you're a change agent and a change reformer, because you got to be willing to take risks and recognize what those risks look like in order to implement that change. But I just wondered again, again, I'm reading these letters and I'm like, wow, that's so bold and that's so courageous. But I wonder, right? Like, what is the relationship here that David had the confidence to say, I'm not doing it? And the answer is no, because at the end of the day, I'm giving up on whatever plan you had for me. And this will be the plan that I will execute and follow on my own. And so David was very adamant that his next journey will be in medicine. And so he will find that mentor, he will find that support that will help him pursue that. And so in 1844, David then went to New York and started connecting with folks who will allow him to start to enter the world and enter the field of medicine. And so that was his stance that, again, I will no longer be a part of whatever plan you now have set for me. And so David then goes on, and again, the story, there's gaps, right? But I curated this based upon the letters that we had at the institution in relation to the University of Tulane as well, because a collection of John McDonough's letters went to the University of Tulane. So it was a combination of both. But David went on to end up having a hospital in Harlem on West 41st Street. And so it was the first Black hospital in Harlem, but more importantly, it was the first Black hospital in Harlem that also had white patients. So again, something about David McDonogh broke barriers across the board that people just gravitated towards him. And David also too became the first doctor, and I butcher this every time, of throat, ear, and mouth. And what is now Columbia University and Columbia Hospital. And so again, to think about my Black family and that great, what was the direct quote, great slaves of promise, to now becoming Dr. David McDonogh, right? So to defy all odds of a slave paperwork to now having your own practice, your own building, in 1898 in Harlem. So to think about that journey, all that transpired in between, Kernan is who he was, what he did, and the foundation that he laid, again, for folks that followed after him. But he was a trailblazer in his own right. And I wish, again, we had more letters. We reached out to Columbia University to ask what they have. At the hospital, they actually have a dedication to David McDonogh and his works to honor his legacy. And so that was awesome. But we reached out to the New York City Public Library to ask if they have any, again, archive on the hospital. And so all they had was the image that we have of where the hospital was and what it looked like at the time. But I wish, again, that there was more information that we could use for not only our collection, but at the time to really build out the exhibit. Washington then later on went to Liberia and then became a legislator to write the Declaration of Independence for Liberia, right? So how awesome is that, right? To fulfill a plan that may not have I don't even believe John McDonogh actually foreshadowed that, right? But Washington McDonogh went on to Liberia, and then during his journey to Liberia, and again, we have a letter that he reconnected with his mother and his sister, and in the journey to Liberia, was married and lost a child. In the journey to Liberia, once he was at Liberia, wrote the last letter that we have from Washington to John McDonogh to say that this is the first time in my life that I'm seeing other people like me and I feel whole. I feel like I belong. Something just feels right. Don't know what that something is, but it just feels right. Didn't say thank you, didn't say because of you, didn't say your vision, your plan worked. Just said, first time in my life, I'm looking to the left or the right of me and I feel whole. And that's beautiful. He feels free and equal of being amongst his people. But again, that Madison and Monroe, John McDonogh said he wasn't that bright, but he wrote the Declaration of Independence for a country, right? And so how awesome is that? That's pretty badass if you ask me. So it's pretty cool to think about what they went to do and the impact that they had, not only domestically, but now internationally, and not only in Little Easton, but also in the world. And so in this image we have, it was given to us by way of Cetra Crew in Liberia, and in the depiction, it's numbered of who the men are. And so you really can't see it that well, but there's a red podium, and at the front it's number 2, and it's his signature and his name, and it's Washington McDonogh at the podium. And if you look at the Declaration of Independence for Liberia, he's the first signature, but his penmanship based upon the signature and the Declaration of Independence, he wrote it. So it's just awesome. It's just awesome. Unfortunately, again, we don't have any letters going back and forth. We don't have any letters as to what was life for him in Liberia. But again, just to have that last letter that he wrote to John McDonogh to say that I'm seen, I'm whole, I feel equal, and I'm free, is beautiful, because he got that in Africa, and David got that when he got his hospital. And again, they fulfilled their promise, nobody else's, but their promise. When David McDonogh died, the Lafayette, the newspaper, David McDonogh is the only Lafayette alum to pass and to get a 3-page obituary in the Lafayette newspaper. The only Lafayette alum to ever have a 3-page obituary in the Lafayette newspaper. And so his peers, again, thought so highly of him that they called him a pioneer. And in the Lafayette newspaper, which I also thought was extremely fascinating, when you look at the graduates of David's class, they're alphabetized by last name, and David's name is not in that order. However, at the very last, there's an asterisk and there's David's name. One of the classmates said, the best speaker at commencement, but he wasn't listed as a keynote speaker or a speaker at commencement. So it's also ironic how we also want to rewrite history when not acknowledging actually the history that took place. Right? So those who write history tell history, and that's the history that we live off. But again, the legacy that he left behind impacted his peers, and clearly those that came after him. To again, can't emphasize that enough, to be the only Lafayette alum to get a 3-page obituary in the school newspaper. So again, his legacy went on to truly be a pioneer and the impact that he had. This was one of the things that I truly struggled with the most throughout the exhibit, and it's the 100-year gap. And it's the 100-year gap that in 1846 to 1947, Lafayette didn't admit another Black student. And I really struggled with that. And I still kind of struggle with that, if I'm being quite honest, because why? What does that mean, right? If we think about, again, from day one, from the beginning, we had folks who were princes, from Africa. We had David and Washington McDonogh. We had Aaron Hoff. We had other folks who came into our community to then stop it for 100 years. What was the institutional decision, or what was the national landscape that altered our investment, our interest, and our inclusivity of welcoming Black folks into Lafayette College, to then later on do it after World War II because you were Tuskegee Airmen? To then again think from 1947 to then you have folks who came in the 60s, to then in the 70s, to then coeducation. And then from coeducation, you then had these periods and these pockets and these moments of Black bodies coexisting and co-authors coming into the Lafayette space that are not a part of the majority. Again, we looked, college doesn't have any documentation on what that story means. We couldn't find any writings from any president around that gap. But I wonder. And so that was something that I was very adamant and did not negotiate when thinking about this exhibit, of why that needed to be told. Because again, if we think about the story from looking at slave papers, to being a legislator, to Liberia, to being the first doctor at Columbia Hospital. And then we're going to go 100 years without even acknowledging the impact and the legacy and the work of Black people. Find that to be very troubling and problematic, but I want to know why, right? What does that mean? Who made that decision? Who allowed that to continue? And why is this not being talked about, right? In the space of discourse, we can challenge this stuff all day, but these aren't the discussions that we're having within our community. And so again, I wanted that to be very prominent within the exhibit at Pardee Hall. And then within the last slide, and what I love about this image the most is because the first hospital that David had burned down in an electrical fire. And so because of his influence and because of his impact, it was a community outcry, and the community helped raise the money for the groundbreaking of the second hospital. However, the second hospital, and I don't have the name of the politician who was in the middle, but that second hospital never came to fruition. It was never built, never happened. But we have this image, and that came from the New York Times. And so again, the text and the language is there of, again, the groundbreaking of the McDonogh Memorial Hospital, of his new location. And again, if you look at that image, that's a community, that's a tribe, that's folks saying, like, we need this hospital back, and it's his hands and his mind and his work that we can't sacrifice and we can't go without. But again, we don't have the rationale, we don't have the language, and we don't have the story as to why that second hospital wasn't built. And so again, when thinking about that story from beginning to end, slaves were a great promise to being young men and great men that changed the world. And so I wanted to tell this story. I wanted it to be seen. This story didn't deserve and didn't belong to just be in the Port Luck Black Cultural Center. This needed to be in the presence of everybody in a prominent space that we all see. And so I was more than certain that it needed to be in Pardee Hall. And the reason why I chose Pardee Hall is because the traffic and the flow of Pardee Hall is that at any space and at any entry point, you're immersing yourself into the exhibit. And so for those folks who haven't had the opportunity of being on campus or haven't seen the exhibit, one, when you do come to campus, check it out. It's in Pardee Hall. But for those who are on campus or can get to campus, again, at any point you come in, you can see it. And so there's a chair rail above that shows you what that story looks like visually from New Orleans to Harlem. And during that time period of how, again, campus changed from being at the bottom of the hill to the top of the hill to Harlem. And then telling that story visually, which you saw in these slides, but also telling that narrative and what that story looks like. And again, entering those points of campus, you're immersing yourself into this exhibit. And so I wanted that story and that narrative to be told. And that was also the reason why I titled this exhibit Tales of Our Brothers, was multiple reasons. One, it was an all-male college. So brothers being a play on word of, again, brothers being the Black community, that's ours, but brothers also too being the fellow leopards. We're all in this journey together. And then ours being very vague, but very intentional. Who does that belong to? But I also don't feel like it's a sense of belonging either. That is our story being Lafayette. It's our story being Black narrative, the Black community. It's our story being theirs, and our story being the collective and the larger community. And so how do we tell that story? And so that's all that I have for slides. And so I would just love to now open this up for questions and to make this more of a conversation.
Well, thank you very much, Robert. Quite an inspiring account of history that need to be contextualized, recognizing the presence of the Black presence on campus and within this community, the essence of our presence, the defiance, giving the opportunity, the ability to persevere, and also express our individuality. All of that are reflected in the way you told the story. And I think I added that I did some work in Liberia and was actually able to visit the original home of Washington McDonogh and saw some of the remnants there. So this legacy research that started with the archival records is a continuing story because there's a whole lot more that need to be told about what we have contributed not only to the Lafayette community, but also to American history, culture, and civilization as a whole. So thank you very much for the presentation. And as you pointed out, we wanted this to be a conversation, so if you want to chime in and add your contribution, that's fine. You can put questions in the chat room, which Janine will read, so we get it organized. But again, we want to initially thank Rob for introducing this topic and giving us the opportunity to talk about it. All right. So we open the floor for comments, contributions, your own personal stories and where it fits into the gaps that he identified. Washington and David came to campus with swag, and at the same time defied the odds and succeeded in achieving their goals, both professionally and personally. And I think this is a very noble story to be told.
Rob, thank you so much for that talk. I do have a few questions that I can pull from the chat. Leslie Ann Howard, class of 76, wanted to know what the year was that the McDonogh brothers arrived at Lafayette.
To my understanding, it was 1830. Oh, I might have it here.
'38.
I have 1837, 1838.
Yeah. And Richard Lawrence, class of 77, commented, could it possibly have been a father-son situation between John McDonogh and the McDonogh brothers?
Yeah, that was against,
that.
Yeah, that was something that, again, I scratched my head on and really was like, something don't add up here.
Well, can I interrupt? I don't know if anybody can hear me. Diane and I researched this extensively, and there are writings that describe David as being Black, like African. It was not uncommon to call somebody father and a slave owner to call them son. I don't think there's any doubt that he was not John McDonogh's child. Diane and I went through this quite extensively, and I think she can speak to it even better than I. But that intrigue is way past us. That's not in the books.
I don't see any more questions in the chat, but that doesn't mean that folks may not have more questions. If you do, oh wait, here we do. Do we have any insight into David and Washington's time as slaves, Also, what do we know about Washington's studies and interests at Lafayette? We know David was interested in the sciences, but do we have any idea what Washington concentrated on or enjoyed, and what both of their times were like as slaves?
Yeah, so again, from what I had is, again, the collection. We also don't even know if he was, and when I say he, David McDonogh was actually invested or in the studies of science. It was just, again, a passion of his that I think he connected himself with mentors and folks that could help him navigate into that space. We don't have anything documented of as far as what Washington was connected with or interested in studying, or what their campus life experience was. Based upon the letters, we knew again where they were staying, and that was very separate from where everybody else was, from the college edifice. And again, just as far as what David's passions were, it was just around him saying, I'm going into medicine because that's where I'm passionate about, and invested into that field and study. But we don't have any letters as far as, again, what they majored in or what they were invested in during their time at campus.
Janine, I hate to keep doing this, but,
Yeah,
and you
Richard,
don't know
come in.
who I am, and that's okay.
No, can you introduce yourself and your connection with Diane? Because I think that's important to put what you're saying in context. Please do that.
Diane and I put 10 years into this, and a lot of money and a lot of travel. I've been down to New Orleans 4 or 5 times to the John McDonogh Library. There are other libraries, by the way, extant, where there's material that you wonder how it got there. But let me add some color commentary if I can. There are no letters that say he was interested in science, but David was interested in medicine. We have very little information about Washington. David pestered John so much so that John finally threw up his hands and said, okay, I'm going to let you intern with a physician in Easton, Pennsylvania. So he went downtown, and his first letter to John was so excited. It was unbelievable. It was like a young child. I was so touched by it. And everyone got bled in those days. It didn't matter what you were, what the disease were. You got bled because medicine was a hoax pretty much all through and through until about the 1850s. So David described bleeding this patient where the blood, when it hit the ceiling, everyone was soaked with blood. He wasn't put off by it at all. He was very, very excited about this whole thing and wrote to John very excitedly about this occurrence and his interest. And from that, his passion for medicine grew, and there was a drumbeat. And David argued with John. There were a number of letters back and forth through his intermediaries. But David finally won the day in a sort of backhanded way because John just threw up his hands. By the way, Washington left prematurely after 2 years. He was sent to Liberia with a family of 90 other Lafayette freed slaves. So he left. One of the reasons you don't know much about Washington is he wasn't there very long. Now, David, on the other hand, was not only there for the 4 years. For those of us who graduated, I loved it for 4 years, but 4 years was enough. David was there for 6 years. He had sort of a junior college development, and then he was into the real thing. And he was obviously a good student. He always said that he was number 3 in his class. He didn't necessarily walk the campus freely. There are a lot of letters, and I'll tell you an anecdote if you want to hear it. But David, finally, John threw up his hands somewhere late in his junior year, early senior, and said, I can't really handle this anymore. And he cut off funding. And he got to New York, and I might surmise that. And he was introduced to the man who founded my hospital, John Kearney Rogers. And that's how David got the middle name Kearney, because John Kearney Rogers, for whatever reason, just felt this man was exemplary. And John Kearney Rogers wrote in a memorandum before he founded the infirmary that there had to be more sensitivity to poor people, diversity, etc. He was really way ahead of his time. So Kearney Rogers, John Kearney Rogers, put a gun to the head of the dean and the president of Columbia, which was a little college down in the south part of the city in those days. It was very little uptown, and it was an early medical school. And he was allowed to mentor David through the medical school. But when it came time for graduation, the dean said if he doesn't follow the script to the American Colonization Society and leave, he's not getting a degree. So he never got a degree. So about 4 years ago, I got really, my wife was very concerned. So I wrote a letter to the dean, who happens to be African-American. Her name is Taylor. And I said, by the way, we're going public with the story of David. And we had spent a lot of money and we found his great-granddaughter. So I was introduced to his great-granddaughter. We gave her a background. She knew her great-grandfather was pretty renowned in the family zone. And she's very proud of what she's learned. So Diane and I went to a meeting that was inaugurated by an intermediary friend of mine, a physician at Columbia. And we met with the dean and a group of other of her underlings, and we presented the facts. And she sort of backed off and said, I'm not sure this is real. And then to my surprise, in May of 2018, the medical school is called the Vagelos School of Medicine, another millionaire buying off a medical school, thank you very much. And he started a $1 million McDonogh scholarship, and they brought the granddaughter, which I and Diane found, and presented her with a posthumous degree, which is what we had challenged the college to do. Never told us about this, by the way. And I called the dean and she said, oh, you guys had nothing to do with this. This was all argument. I was really ticked off. Talk about being angry, Robert. I was really angry. But we got done what we wanted to get done. We wanted David's recognition to grow. There are now McDonogh societies at Columbia University. There's a McDonogh Society at Lafayette College. There's a McDonogh Society at Mount Sinai, New York Eye and Ear Infirmary. And there's a McDonogh Society at the National Medical Association, which was originally founded as a counter to the AMA. And there's a friend of mine who's a physician ophthalmologist. And Robert, David, when he didn't get a degree, John Kearney Rogers brought him to the New York Eye and Ear Infirmary, the oldest specialty hospital in the United States. And he gave him a position in which he became the first Black ophthalmologist, not Odo, whatever it is. He was the first, and in my papers, you might see there at the obituary in a New York paper. The Times did not exist back then, by the way, Rob. There is an obituary, and it says very clearly that David was an attending surgeon at the New York Eye and Ear Infirmary for 11 years. The hospital was built not in Harlem. It was built on 41st Street, far west on 41st Street, as you saw the picture. It was basically a clapboard wood place. It was not necessarily, it was run by a man who eventually became the head of the NAACP. It wasn't a Black hospital per se. It was actually a military hospital for the Spanish-American War, but it was teaching young Black women to be nurses. The second, it closed very abruptly. I don't think it burned down, but it closed in early 1900s. The second hospital was begun, the initiation was 1918. So you can imagine there were a lot of people who remembered David and wanted this as a keepsake. And it probably didn't, I have newspaper articles. I did a deep dive in this. There was a very, very aggressive attempt to build this hospital. But I think what happened was, at that time, Harlem Hospital was being built. And there was just not enough funding, enough interest to have two major hospitals in the Harlem area. So unfortunately, David's hospital did not get built. And to show you the confusion about it, if you look carefully at that picture, Robert, of the McDonogh Memorial Hospital, they spelled David's name wrong. They spelled it with an O-U-G-H. They thought he was an Irishman. But nonetheless, the hospital was built. It's a keeper. When I tell all my patients, and I tell every one of my patients this story, everyone's got it up to hear about David McDonogh in my practice. So if anybody, and one of my patients is a head of screenwriting for National Geographic, and we have written a 6-part biopic series for television, which we were negotiating, by the way, with Brad Pitt. And then he decided to take the Underground Railroad, which you all know. But now we have turned this into a theater piece, and we're hoping that we can move it to be incubated at Lafayette College. So one way or the other, we keep pushing this story, and with all your help, and obviously Robert running the flag up. But there are some inconsistencies in the story. I just wanted to point them out.
Richard, thank you so much for adding to the conversation. I do want to say, I know there's, I'm sure, a lot more questions. So if anyone has any more questions, feel free to ask. But I would also say that I invite folks to come back to campus and visit the archives at Skillman to see some of these artifacts and to dive deeper into the subject and the history of the McDonogh brothers, as well as Lafayette's Black history. Elaine Stomber is our college archivist, and I'm sure she would be happy to assist anyone with that. But curious to know if anyone else has any more questions or comments or thoughts.
Janine, I have a comment on
Sure.
Washington McDonogh. Washington was actually interested in religion and was sent as a missionary to Liberia. He went as a missionary. And my recollection of my inquiring in Liberia was that he actually set up about 4 or 5 schools as a missionary, traveling around the country in the rural areas, setting up missionaries schools, and then setting up churches in Liberia. Eventually came to Monrovia, which is the capital, where he became a legislator and actually participated in writing the Constitution. So he left Lafayette after 2 years, having an interest in religion, which was basically what McDonogh wanted them to be missionaries going back to Africa. And he carried that mission forward and actually honored it completely as a missionary in Liberia, as well as a legislator over there. So there are 2 stories which basically follow their personalities very, very, very well. I think there's a lot more research to be done in Liberia to follow up, to fill that gap and provide a more complete story about his exploits in the country beyond just being a legislator. But actually the influence he has on the citizens as a whole in our country is very important. All right. So I just wanted to add that to the narrative. Okay.
I know I'm being very verbose. I'm going to give Robert a challenge. If you look at, there's a picture Diane has of David's stone at the cemetery in Woodlawn, and it's a huge edifice. And I went up there when we started the studies 8 years ago to Woodlawn. I brought flowers. I thought it would be appropriate. And I sat down with the archivist at Woodlawn Cemetery. They actually have an archivist. She knew nothing about David. So they pulled out the files. They keep all this, the original files. I saw the original papers, cemetery papers, designs and everything. And she was aghast. Why was she aghast? David's tombstone is about 20 paces behind the main building, which was reserved only for people of great renown. Woodlawn had a separate part of the cemetery that was all Black, like a Duke Ellington and those people. But David's stone is set in a place of great remembrance. And why didn't she know that? And people walk by it every day. Because you have to read the epitaph, and that's the key to this. They thought he was Irish, I think, but what his wife wrote is very, very telling. Some people object to it because they think it was pandering, but I think, Robert, you might research this, find out why this happened, why it was placed there, what happened in 1895 when he died that was recognition, or 1898. So that's the story in itself. There's something about where he is buried that even in those days, and the hospital itself sort of supports that, there was something about him. And yes, he had white patrons, people of Fifth Avenue. I actually tracked one down who had been hurt in a horse's carriage accident on Fifth Avenue and 69th Street. And she was a patient of his. How this white, wealthy Presbyterian got to David McDonogh in Little Africa, because by the way, that's where his office was. It was down in what now is West Village. So there's a lot of mysterious things. There's a lot of room for research. It's going to take younger people like you to do it, but there's still a big story to be told here.
Thank you, Richard. Quincy, if you want to come off mute and ask your question.
Great, thank you. Thanks for this outstanding presentation. I've heard this story from, when it was first sort of brought to light after I graduated, and then, everything since. But this is the first time I really got this much color around it, which is fantastic. So my question is, Robert, is this history and story integrated into any of the actual curriculum at Lafayette, or does it only live hoping that the students will actually take the time to, look at all the great work that you put together and, see the statue, so do you have any sense that this has been integrated into the curriculum?
That's a great question, Quincy. First of all, how you doing? So glad to see you, man. Two-pronged, right? So the work continues through Africana, Professor Wilson Fall, through Professor Heaney, where we'll add it to the curriculum, and then we're going to go, and again, it's a living doc. So we're going to go to special collections. We're going to work with Elaine Stomber. We're going to work with the materials, and we're going to digitize it. We're going to use technology and how do we make this into a website? How do we talk about it? But there's so much more that can be done. And it's one of those things now that I think and I feel, I'll use an I statement, that has become artwork in Party Hall. And it's become artwork that you go, ooh, ah. And just like the statue behind me, it's artwork that folks go, ooh, ah. But and when I say they, I say the majority of the campus, it's not resonating with them as part of their history for being affiliated with Lafayette College. And so if I could wave a magic wand and I could have it my way, these are the conversations that we're having in the freshman year seminar. These are the conversations that we're having before you matriculate into our community. These are the conversations that we're having way beyond even reunion, right? This is our history. And so how do you talk about our history that is not only evolving within the curriculum, but opportunity for an independent study, an opportunity for a thesis to evolve, an opportunity for a student to say, hey, is there any institutional dollars for me to do an alternative spring break down in New Orleans? Right? Let's continue the work. So to answer your question, no. But can it be possible? Absolutely. But I think we can be a bit more proactive and intentional of welcoming it and introducing it instead of waiting for somebody to knock on the door to say, can I? So it's happening, but it's happening in very niche and small communities where I truly feel like it should be intertwined into the core of the curriculum, that it's almost like breathing, that it's just known that this is part of our culture and our community. Great question. Thank you.
Yeah, Rob, let me come in to supplement what you're saying, because we had that conversation just before this presentation started. We're just chatting before we started the presentation, and thought that there should be a class or a course that handles this. And also earlier this week, I had a conversation with Janine where there's a lot of history and legacy of Blackness on campus that a lot of students and the community is not even aware of. So the question of molding all of that into something that is presented within the curriculum in a way that is across disciplines, so that the entire community is aware of this legacy on campus, is very important. And it's something that we want to engage in that conversation and figure out a way to basically build that legacy and incorporate that into the curriculum or into our activities on campus in a way that's more visible than it is right now. So a very good question, and something that we need to proactively take a closer look at. Thank you, Quincy.
I can tell you that I'm working with the chairs of the McDonogh Network, who unfortunately were unable to be part of this evening, and also working with two young students current students who I've hired as McDonogh interns, and looking at how we can make the extensive Black history at Lafayette more known, and not just during Black History Month of February, but throughout the year. I've had a discussion with my colleague who's running Reunion to possibly do a walking tour of Black history during Reunion, so our alumni can learn more. And then also chatting with the two interns about creating some social media, so that particularly students who are interested in Lafayette, or incoming freshmen who've already committed to Lafayette, can learn more right from the get-go about the McDonogh brothers, about the McDonogh Network, about the overall Black history at Lafayette. So there are definitely things in the works. And I really look forward to partnering with folks across campus, as well as our alumni, in bringing that to fruition. Did anyone else have any questions or comments? And feel free to just come off mute to voice your question, because it's like looking at a very large Brady Bunch group here. So I won't be able to catch everyone's face at once. Okay. Well, I really appreciate everyone spending time this evening to learn more about the McDonogh brothers. I really encourage anyone who has any interest in becoming involved in the McDonogh Network and forwarding the various programs that we're looking to do to help and to join us. So if you have any interest in that, please reach out to the McDonogh Network or Alumni Relations. We're going to send you a follow-up email that will have links for folks to join, and also a survey, as well as a link to where this talk will be housed next week. So Rob, thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking your time. It is Rob's son's first birthday today, so I really appreciate him taking the time right now away from his little one to celebrating his first birthday to chat with us this evening. Rex, thank you so much as well. I know you were running from the Dyer Center real estate competition, so I know it's been quite a long marathon day for you as well. And I thank all of you for joining us as well. I know you are busy in your professional and personal lives, so I really appreciate you taking the time this evening. So thank you all, and I hope to see you again soon.